I have a theory, or perhaps it's more of a delusion. The basic hypothesis though is this. Porygon was originally intended to be a fourth Eeveelution at some point during the development of the original 151 Pokemon and games. It's something I'm now presenting to the world and proclaiming as the 137 theory, because after cross-referencing aspects like the written Pokédex entries with the lore and other key elements, I think there's enough material to justify me posing the argument on the internet that Porygon originally was conceived as a sibling of Vaporeon, Jolteon and Flareon. And we'll start off with the least convincing reasonings first and build our way up. Speaking of which, first things first, numbers. When looking at the numerical categorization of the Pokédex, we have Eevee taking the 133rd spot of the 151 Pokemon in the original dex. Following Eevee, as is typical with evolutions in the dex, are the trio of Vaporeon, Jolteon and Flareon, consigned to 134th, 5th and 6th place respectively. Then, after the original 3 Eeveelutions as we know them, is Porygon, the 137th Pokemon. Coincidence? Really though, while it's interesting to acknowledge Porygon's immediate proximity to Eevee and the Eeveelutions, especially in the context of wondering if the 137 theory has any validity whatsoever, its Pokédex position alone absolutely isn't enough evidence to build a convincing case with. But seeing as we've now got all 5 Pokemon together, let's take a look at some of the shared similarities and key differences regarding their designs. The foundations for Theory 137 were constructed with my last few brain cells when scrolling through the Pokédex list recently. I was categorizing my shiny collection in my home boxes by national Pokédex order, all this happening during some time off work because my idea of fun is gnarly apparently, and I was using the list on Bulbapedia as a reference. Then, when scrolling downwards through Bulbapedia's dex list, which also shows each Pokemon's official illustration, as we've just seen, it immediately struck me. Porygon has some noticeable overlap in its design when compared to Eevee and the 3 initial Eeveelutions. But do keep in mind as I'm outlining this that Porygon's form is of course intentionally extended and exaggerated in certain ways to align with its brand as a technological Pokemon. Firstly, they all have, compared to so many other Pokemon at least, a comparatively similar physical outline, with circular-esque shaped heads which point out at the nose, a body with limbs and or feet underneath them, enabling them to move, and a prominent tail at the back. If we were to look at all 5 shadowed out, it isn't too far of a stretch to recognise these comparative similarities by outline alone. And though Eevee and the evolutions are more directly reminiscent of earthly fellow forms, it's arguable that Porygon is a kind of cyber fellow form, altered and transformed through the procedure of digital evolution. There are, of course, significant design differences between them too. Porygon very distinctly has no ears, its head and body are polyhedral and jagged, and it's not quadrupedal like the others. It has 2 blocky feet things instead. But these evolutionary differences are changes that you'd completely expect if a Pokemon like Eevee were to morph, change, and evolve into a new cyber-led form, befitting of its new reality. More on that later. A difference that's particularly interesting to me though are Porygon's eyes. Eevee, Vaporeon, Jolteon and Flareon all have black and white eyes, with Eevee's emitting a hazel hue at the bottom. Porygon's though are different. Though still black and white, like the Eeveelutions, but with the colours inverted, the small black pupils surrounded by a mass of white negative space gives an impression of almost coldness or robotic precision, but also of possible technological refinement. Again, as if it's gone through a process of cyber-enabled evolution from its base form as Eevee. It also looks like it's seen some shit, which could have been due to the process of evolving via digital means. With the designs being touched on, what do the official Pokédex entries in the red, blue and yellow games have to say for Eevee and Porygon? This is where things start to get more convincing. The Dex entries for Eevee in red and blue highlight that its genetic code is irregular, and it may mutate if it is exposed to radiation from element stones. In yellow, however, the inherent idiosyncratic nature of Eevee's DNA is pushed further, and there's also additional ambiguity incorporated, with the entry stating that its genetic code is unstable, so it could evolve in a variety of ways. There are only a few alive. It's abundantly clear that Eevee's conceptual and narrative DNA is tightly woven around the idea of it being this somewhat abnormal changeling with broad potential for what it could conceivably become. Despite its cute outward appearance with big round eyes and bushy tail, what lies within is far more complex than meets the human eye. There's also confirmation in yellow that Eevee doesn't only evolve from elemental stones like the water stone, for instance. Other methods are confirmed as possible, but there aren't specificities here around how exactly. The Pokédex entry for Porygon is equally intriguing and distinctive. In red and blue, it's described as a Pokémon that consists entirely of programming code, and who's capable of moving freely in cyberspace. Meanwhile, in yellow, it's referred to as the only Pokémon people anticipate can fly into space. None have managed the feat yet, however. Porygon then is a quasi-real, quasi-virtual thing, capable of existing both in the tangible physical world as well as cyberspace alongside the ones and zeros. Porygon, much like Eevee, is an idiosyncratic outlier within the Cantonian range of Pokémon. But instead of having this erratic genetic code, Porygon is composed entirely of computer code, something that's rational, coherent, and intentionally used to instigate progression, advancement, and furtherance. Thinking about Eevee and Porygon after retracing their very first Pokédex entries, and with Theory 137 in mind, it's interesting to consider Porygon as having potential for being the digital furtherance of Eevee, shedding its biological form and erratic genetic code for one that's technological and inherently logical, and perhaps whose very evolution was facilitated by high-tech methods rather than providing it with an elemental stone or leveling it up through winning in battle or being best pals. And it's the Kanto region specifically, which is home to two innovation-driven institutions entirely capable of enabling such a thing to happen. The Silph Company within the lore is a company that manufactures technological, Pokemon-oriented goods. This includes the 100% catch rate Pokeball, the Master Ball, the Silph Scope, which enables users to see Pokemon instead of ghostly forms, and the upgrade item, which from the Gold, Silver and Crystal games enables Porygon to actually evolve into its official evolution come the second generation, that aptly named Porygon 2. Meanwhile, the Pokemon Lab on Cinnabar Island, also known as the Cinnabar Lab, was, spoilers, a research facility where scientists studied Pokemon DNA, cloning and engineering, and also where players could pick up the ancient fossil Pokemon Aerodactyl, Kabutops and Omastar. Somewhat confusingly, it's been stated in knowledge bases such as Bulbapedia and with citations from the 1996 illustrated book of Pocket Monsters that Porygon was created by the Silph Co. Though, interestingly, an in-game report paper inside the company's headquarters notes that the Pokemon was actually created at the Pokemon Lab on Cinnabar Island. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Both institutions were at the cutting edge of their work, driven by knowledgeable scientists who were enabling advancement at the intersection of technology and Pokemon. And the two hubs possess the intellectual prowess and scientific equipment to bring an advanced, newfangled Cybermon like Porygon into existence. Essentially, these locations provided the perfect breeding ground, pun intended, for Eevee's technological transformation. So what if the original thinking for Porygon wasn't that it was something created on a computer in a lab, and instead a Pokemon who started off life as a regular Eevee and was then shapeshifted through new scientific means? There are many feasible ways for this to have happened in-game too. For instance, the player taking Eevee to the Silph Co headquarters or the Cinnabar Lab themselves, placing Eevee into an in-game PC storage box, trading an Eevee with another player via Game Boy link cable, or perhaps even using the in-game upgrade item, because theoretically, upgrade could have been an item intended for Gen 1, and specifically as the de facto method for evolving Eevee into Porygon. But how based in reality could all this actually be? The process of accumulating these tidbits of trivia after my initial, let's say, brainwave regarding Eevee and Porygon has, in my head at least, helped to add some weight to the hypothesis that at some point in the development of the first 151 Pokemon and the original games, it could have been viable that Porygon was conceived as the fourth Eevee evolution, that it was conceptually devised as what Eevee would become once its changeable DNA came into contact with computers and or cyberspace. From its position in the Pokédex to its noticeable design similarities and differences, the Pokédex entries and the links with the Silph Co and Cinnabar Lab, I think the small, subtle signs are there if, like me, you want to see them. But Porygon, of course, didn't become the fourth Eeveelution. If it was ever on the cards, perhaps Porygon wasn't deemed as cute enough to cut it, because a huge part of the Eevee line's brand has always been centered around its inherent cuteness. Maybe it was thought that a hard-edged, polyhedral Pokemon with a blank, emotionless stare simply wouldn't be able to compete with the others, and would be destined to be relegated as a floppy evolution, sitting alone in the box of player PCs, never getting the chance to be a part of a main team. But as a Pokemon of its own volition, without any evolutionary ties to Eevee to hold it down, it could stand up on its own two polyhedral feet things, able to carve out its own individual niche. And it has. Thinking about other theories why Porygon may have been cut from the Eevee lineage, if it was ever a possibility, perhaps there were issues around typing. For instance, maybe it wasn't thought to be a good idea to have Eevee, a normal Pokemon, evolve into another normal type, especially when Vaporeon, Flareon and Jolteon had the separate and arguably more flavorful typings of water, fire and electric. Or maybe it was something else. The thing is, I don't know, and at the end of the day, this is all just guesswork for a kind of out there hypothesis. Is the 137 theory tenuous? Yeah, it's very tenuous. But there's just enough evidence out there to make me believe that the hypothesis is at least plausible enough for wider discussion and distribution. To not just live rent-free in my head, but other people's too. You're welcome. If you've made it to this point of the video, thank you for listening to my niche ramblings. There are plenty more where that comes from too. And if you subscribe, you'll be one of the first people to know about them. See you soon.